Hello all and welcome to English class. This is going to be a long one. Let's do it. Toni Morrison was an American author and Princeton University professor whose lifetime of groundbreaking work considered the collision of race, gender, power, and history in the United States across some of her most important novels of the 20th century, The Bluest Eye, Beloved, Song of Solomon, and many others. She was presented the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama in 2012, a time when receiving that medal still meant something. Born in 1931, she died in 2019, leaving behind a remarkable legacy as one of the most important Americans of the last 100 years. She also left behind two short stories, Récitatif, which was her only short story from its publication in 1983 until 2015, when she wrote another, Sweetness. Morrison is probably the most widely read Black American woman author, with the exception of Maya Angelou, who was arguably as important and her contemporary. Recitatif takes its title from a term used in opera. In that genre, one has arias, which are the fun and exciting bits, like Nessun Dorma from Turandot or Deux de Fleurs from Lakme. By the way, if you haven't heard Aretha Franklin's version of Nessun Dorma, stop watching this video and watch that one. It's better than mine, and Morrison can wait. Recitatif, meanwhile, is a style of musical declamation that hovers between song and ordinary speech, particularly used for dialogic and narrative interludes. That part came from Wikipedia, thank you. We should think about how the title fits this episodic story though. The story is driven and actually constituted by the uninteresting bits, usually those occurring in what Kelly Reams calls, quote, marginalized spaces. So we have an orphanage, an orchard, a grocery store, a Howard Johnson's, and marginalized times scattered throughout American history, but hardly stuff that makes it into the history books. As the only short story for 30 years of such an important author's career, Recitatif has earned a lot of attention. So let's talk about some major currents in the work: race, gender, and identity. We'll start with race, specifically race in America. Toni Morrison writes in her staggeringly influential book of literary criticism, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, that, quote, Recitatif was an experiment in the removal of all racial codes from a narrative about two characters of different races for whom racial identity is crucial. That, of course, is the hook of the story. We don't know the race of Twyla and Roberta, only that one is black and one is white. Now, it shouldn't actually matter, indeed that's the point, but it does. It matters to them and it matters to us, and indeed it even matters to literary critics. Most actually play into Morrison's game, trying to figure out which character is which. So Morrison does a good job though of masking that fact within her story. She makes what Reams calls, quote, a matrix of class, race, and bodies that highlight our tendency to read race as class and to attribute meanings to physical bodies. This, of course, references an uncomfortable aspect of American or human society, our need to categorize. Morrison is attuned to this, never allowing one character's language or financial status to collectively suggest racial status. Critic Elizabeth Abel, meanwhile, suggests that readers tend to identify the race of Twyla, the first-person narrator, as a member of their own race. So if one is white, one reads Twyla as white. Conversely, if one is black. Reams, meanwhile, states rather strangely and proudly that she can, quote, read either girl as either race, and I often switch the characters' racial identities as I read the story. What I cannot do is read the story without assigning race to the characters. Damn. Anyway, for example, when Twyla sees Roberta at a grocery store, Roberta fails to recognize her at first. Their conversation is interrupted by the cashier. Capitalism, anyone? And Roberta tells Twyla to meet her outside where, quote, she was waiting for me, and her huge hair was sleek now, smooth around a small, nicely shaped head. Shoes, dress, everything lovely and summery and rich. I was dying to know what happened to her, how she got from Jimi Hendrix to Annandale, a neighborhood full of doctors and IBM executives. Easy, I thought. Everything is so easy for them. They think they own the world. This can reference the fact that, like Bellina suggests, race is tightly imbricated with class, but she lives in Newburgh, New York, a majority-minority city. Or, as Reams suggests, it could be an allusion to affirmative action and other social programs meant to elevate poor minority groups, programs usually met with skepticism or outright hostility by some whites. Gender. David Goldstein Shirley goes so far as to proclaim, quote, in no way does gender figure into Recitatif, end quote. Challenge accepted. Recent scholars contend that it has everything to do with gender, particularly gendered power and gendered friendships. We'll start with power. Power, particularly kyriarchical power. Kyriarchy is complicated, and it might be fictitious. The word exists in modern Greek denoting sovereignty, but Elizabeth Schluser-Fiorenza reinvented the term in 1992 to describe, quote, a sociocultural and religious system of domination constituted by intersecting multiplicative structures of oppression, end quote. It's very similar to Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality, which seeks to map out layers of structural oppression. Basically, it's four-dimensional patriarchy chess, wherein all the inputs, no matter how diverse, end up further entrenching male dominance. Think how religion and capitalism reinforce already extant and problematic male social privileges, and with more prominence in capitalist domination comes political power too, at least in our system. In the story, Miss Itkin, otherwise known as Big Bozo, which is awesome, stands allegorically for totalitarian power without being a man. She is in service of the man, though, the government man. She also serves classed and racialized and other ideological norms that tend to villainize the less fortunate. Villainize, by the way, comes from the old Latin term for villager, the sort of uncultured peons, the poor people. Through her, we see that the solution to this predicament isn't necessarily empowering any woman, because they can be just as callous with that power's application as men, and both genders are hopelessly tangled up in webs of allegiances and liabilities. Maggie, on the other hand, stands for the helpless victims of that power and other greater and perhaps more malevolent powers. She is paradigmatically subordinate, being a minority, a woman, old, disabled, unskilled, and literally lacking a voice to assert her membership as an agent in the world. If we think of Gayatri Spivak's famous article, Can the Subaltern Speak?, we have our answer in Maggie, who is literally mute. It doesn't go well for Maggie, of course. No one has her back, perhaps because allegiances are complicated. She figures prominently, though, in the story, and we'll get that to in a moment. Roberta and Twyla resist Big Bozo. Together, they are able to stand against her totalizing momentum, the one which seeks to control and homogenize their lives and their narratives into something more acceptable. When they eventually leave the state girls' home, though, they stand alone, without reinforcement in a hostile, hierarchical world of overlapping power structures, the reins of which are mostly held by white men whose interests are generally opposed to their own. Now for friendships. Susan Morris uses a fitting epigraph to begin her article on Récitatif. In it, Morrison discusses the state of women's depictions in literature at the time of her novel's publication. When I was writing Sula, I was under the impression that for a large part of the female population, a woman friend was considered a secondary relationship. A man and a woman's relationship was primary. Women, your own friends, were always secondary relationships when the man was not there. To have heterosexual women who are friends, who are talking only about themselves to each other, seemed to me a very radical thing when Sula was published. Have you ever heard of the Bechdel test? In short, most films which are overwhelmingly led by white males don't have two women characters in them at all, and if they do, those two characters don't talk about anything other than a man. Hierarchical power is a hell of a drug. Recitative smashes that crap. The plot is completely driven by women's relationships with one another and barely mentions men at all, and when it does, they only serve as the occasional foil. The story contains, in a rather tight space, women depicted as mothers, friends, intimidating older girls, intimidating authority figures, protesters, retail workers, and friends progressing into acquaintances. For much of the story, Roberta and Twyla are really just friends with one another. Sure, they go their separate ways, but the friendship is genuine, born out of mutual suffering and unmotherly mother figures, one of whom was sick, one of whom, quote, dances all night. They joke and cry and laugh and infuriate each other and get over it, especially at the story's conclusion. Race isn't gone from this equation, though, as Elizabeth Schultz argues, writing that, quote, most novels describe white women as functioning from a position of power in their relationships with black women, end quote. That, I think, is why many scholars believe Twyla to be the black character. Roberta is pretty catty, pretty pretentious. This power dynamic is shown in the infamous Howard Johnson scene, wherein Roberta comes into a restaurant Twyla is waitressing at. Roberta asks what she's been up to and where she's living. Roberta responds to Twyla with, quote, Newburgh, no kidding. She laughed then a private laugh that included the guys, but only the guys, and they laughed with her. What could I do but laugh too and wonder why I was standing there with my knees showing out from under that uniform? Without looking, I could see the blue and white triangle on my head, my hair shapeless in a net, my ankles thick in white Oxfords. Nothing could have been less sheer than my stockings. Twyla experiences kyriarchic suffering here in multiple ways. For one, she's dressed as a worker, one who expressly earns a living through the performance of domestic duties in a public space, seeking the monetized approval of patrons. In so doing, she is forced to observe herself from the position of those advantaged enough to be waited upon. She others herself, but strangely enough, she isn't totally relegated to oppressed femininity, as long as we accept Paul Thoreau's assertion that femininity is, quote, an oppressive sense of nakedness, versus an ill-fitting coat in the case of men, if you're wondering. Roberta, on the other hand, is both revealed and opaque. Like the men who accompany her, her face is nearly completely obscured from view by her hair, and what little can be seen is effaced with makeup. That said, she's wearing revealing clothing, and the makeup that cloaks her identity also marks her as a gendered subject, one who has almost willingly accepted her subordination to her male companions. Where's the fucking solidarity, Roberta? Well, we'll get there when we get there. First, though, we'll stop at identity, specifically identitarian construction in the past and in the present. Gendered cultural norms definitely figure into the story, with Roberta seemingly much more willing to have her identity overwritten by a male companion than Twyla. We can think of the boyfriend of Howard Johnson's or her husband. When the women meet at the grocery, Roberta calls herself, quote, Miss Kenneth Norton, end quote. Commence vomit. Race doesn't matter in the story that much in terms of identity until it does. The girls get over their initial discomfort with one another rather quickly, and including their mother's strange reaction to the other in the girls' home. Near the end of the story, though, race arguably informs the different economic and political alignments that cast them in opposition to one another. The protest scene is particularly ripe. Twyla sees Roberta protesting school integration through the busing of students. Roberta's holding a sign stating, quote, mothers have rights too, end quote. After a few days, Twyla joins the counter-protest occurring over the street, narrating. That first day, we were all dignified, pretending the other side didn't exist. The second day, there was name-calling and finger gestures, but that was about all. People changed signs from time to time, but Roberta never did, and neither did I. Actually, my sign didn't make sense without Roberta's. And so do children what? One of the women on my side asked me. Have rights, I said, as though it was obvious. Here, Twyla seems to understand that her identity is partly, indeed greatly, constituted through her interactions with Roberta, who provides her stability in the narrative, or imagination of herself, by having served not only as a confidant and friend, we're reflections of the friends we keep after all, but also currently as an important witness to her past. This is what's so disturbing about their inability to definitively categorize Maggie's race, who Roberta claims is black and further claims was basically assaulted by Twyla when they were children. Twyla narrates that, quote, Roberta had messed up my past somehow with that business about Maggie. I wouldn't forget a thing like that, would I? At the story's conclusion, Roberta speaks with Twyla one last time, saying, quote, I really did think she was black. I didn't make that up. I really thought so. But now I can't be sure. I just remember her as old, so old. And because she couldn't talk, well, you know, I thought she was crazy. Maggie becomes this nodal point for concerns and frustrations about the past being an unreliable and potentially dangerous prologue on which to build one's present sense of self. Roberta, by challenging Twyla's recollections, calls into question some foundational elements of Twyla qua Twyla. She seems to do so out of a combination of fear, self-doubt, and anger, which leads Twyla to realize how contingent her existence is on Roberta's, a person she really only spent a bit of time with years ago. The recitatifs that bridge her life's arias. I'll leave off with Kelly Reams, who writes, quote, as their confusion about Maggie's race mirrors the reader's confusion over the character's racial identities, perhaps the question translates into what happened to make race mean so much. That's it for this one. Stay safe and wash your hands.